This is my TED Talk analysis of the presentation, which is titled, "What if a U.S. Presidential Candidate Refuses to Concede After Election?" that was spoken by Van Jones. The specific purpose of this presentation was to inform the listeners of what could happen if a president doesn't concede and to convince the public to change their part of the legislation. There was logical appeals of his speech. Mr. Jones delivers a speech filled with facts and examples, making his argument irrefutable. By comparing other elections and concession speeches, he uses analytical reasoning to back up his statement. He brings up a study regarding peaceful protesting to provide evidence that will bring people into the protest instead of pushing them away. Mr. Jones strays away from fallacies, but does have some insinuations about what could happen if the president did not concede. This does hurt the overall effectiveness of his reasoning in this manner. He has some emotional appeals. Mr. Jones continues to pull in his listener by putting a value on each person's vote. He also continues to add emotion when it pertains to protesting and the power that the president has with conceding in an election. Mr. Jones continues to pull emotion in with statements in regards to the current COVID-19 pandemic and how it's hard on the people like me. A listener also cannot deny the emotional language that he includes throughout his entire speech. Mr. Jones also appeals in the credibility section. Mr. Jones establishes initial credibility with stating his credentials as an attorney, political commentator, and as a White House official. At first, he does waver with his credibility with stating he did not know how the elections work. However, he resolved this lack of knowledge very quickly with stating he did a bunch of research for a year. Mr. Jones maintains credibility during his entire speech and leaves with terminal credibility by finding common ground and having conviction to the end of his speech. Now, Mr. Jones' organization of his speech doesn't have very much organization. He does have a clear introduction and a very powerful, lasting conclusion. The body of the speech just does not include a clear line or section to his speech. Mr. Jones' introduction was also slightly unclear on what his main point was of his speech, but his conclusion was able to resolve this confusion. The delivery, Mr. Jones, was clear and understandable throughout the entirety of his speech and made it very easy to understand what he was trying to explain to his listeners. At the beginning, Mr. Jones does stumble with a couple of verbal fillers like ums in the very beginning of the speech, but was able to prevent these as he got more comfortable delivering his speech. The overall effectiveness, I found that Mr. Jones was very effective while explaining his concern of the way that the system works. He also shows his passion throughout his speech and how he feels that we, the voters, have the ability to stand up for our voice. His speech was very informative on a matter that otherwise was hard to understand and was able to convey a message that was both persuasive and informative.